Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 186 and it's titled Matcha Minotaurs. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen cards. And before we jump in, I do want to apologize. I know my voice probably sounds a little bit off. I am a little bit under the weather, so hopefully it doesn't come through too much in the video, but we're going to push through no matter what. So starting off with our random card of the week. This one is completely random. In this case, we have Sethron Hurloon General, which is 3 red for a 4/4 legendary creature Minotaur warrior. Whenever Sethron Hurloon General or another non-token Minotaur enters the battlefield under your control, create a 2/3 red Minotaur creature token. Then you can pay 2 and either a black or a red, and Minotaurs you control get +1/+0 and gain menace and haste until the end of turn. So there's a lot going on with this card, but it really boils down to one key aspect, and that is Minotaurs. So one of the nice things about Sethron is that he is a legendary creature, so of course that means he's going to be our commander for this week. And you can probably already guess, I don't think I have to do too much explaining as we jump into our themes for this deck, that our first theme of this deck is, of course, Minotaurs. We want to put as many Minotaurs into the deck as possible and hopefully get to a point in the game where we're able to just kind of run away with, well, the game. Because Minotaurs tend to do a pretty good job of making other Minotaurs and pumping each other up and doing extra damage. So for example, we have Rage Blood Shaman, which is 1 red for a 2/3 Minotaur Shaman. It's got trample, and it says other Minotaur creatures you control get +1/+1 and have trample. So this is a great way if we're going wide, especially with Sethron giving us a bunch of tokens. We can pump up the team, make everything a 3/4, which is significantly better than a 2/3 because it's avoiding a lot of the main red removal. And it's giving everything trample, so we can push our way through blockers. We don't have to worry about getting stopped by little tokens and 1/1s and things like that. So that is kind of the vast majority of the deck, but we do still have a couple of other sub-themes that work well with what we're trying to do. The first of those themes is discard. There's a surprising amount of Minotaurs that actually care about discarding cards or want us to discard cards or even have us do something when we discard cards, so we may as well use discarding as our main card draw engine for the deck. And what I mean by that is we're playing cards like Cathartic Reunion, which is 1 and a red for a sorcery, as an additional cost to cast this spell. Discard 2 cards, then draw 3 cards. So it's not technically card advantage because we're going down 3 cards and then back up 3 cards, but it's card selection, and it's a great way for us to churn through our deck, find the pieces that we need, and get us to a position where we're capable of putting a ton of Minotaurs in play kind of out of nowhere. And we do have cards that care about things being discarded and Minotaurs that care about it, so this can also trigger some of the effects that we have in play. And then finally, we get to our last theme of the deck, and that one is going to be reanimation. Since we're putting a ton of stuff into our graveyard and our Minotaurs are probably also dying in combat, we may as well take advantage of that to try to reanimate all of the Minotaurs out of our graveyard all at once and just kind of surprise the rest of the table with a huge attack. And so to that end, we have cards like Patriarch's Bidding, which is 3 black for a sorcery. Each player chooses a creature type, and each player returns all creature cards of a type chosen this way from their graveyard to the battlefield. Now, obviously, it kind of goes without saying, we are going to be choosing Minotaurs. Hopefully, we're in a position where our opponents aren't also sitting there with typal decks, because then they can get all of their stuff back as well. But even if they are, we're kind of under the assumption that because of our discard outlets, we probably have more of our creature type in our graveyard than our opponents will. So hopefully that's something that we can kind of play around with and make sure that we cast this at a time where it's more beneficial to us than to our opponents. But those are all of our themes for this deck. And before we move on to the next piece of this, we of course got to talk about some key cards. And the key cards in this deck are the cards that synergize very well with what we're doing, are sometimes win conditions or value pieces. And in this deck, if we're being perfectly honest, they're all pretty Minotaur focused. So our first key card is going to be Glint Horn Buccaneer, which is 1 red for a 2/4 Minotaur pirate. It has haste. Whenever you discard a card, Glint Horn Buccaneer deals 1 damage to each opponent, and we can pay 2 to discard a card and draw a card, but we can only activate that ability if Glint Horn Buccaneer is attacking. So one of the main reasons that this is probably the best card in the entire deck is, one, it's a Minotaur, so it fits the theme, but it's also a huge payoff for all of our discard outlets. Being able to discard 2 to 3 cards a turn means we're doing 2 to 3 damage to each opponent every single turn, and that's before we even attack. So being able to attack with a whole team of Minotaurs, probably that are pumped up with Sethron, means we're able to put ourselves in a position where we can win either through combat damage or through the discard damage with Glint Horn Buccaneer. So while this isn't our primary win condition, because obviously our primary win condition is going to be combat, this is still a phenomenal backup win condition that can get us there if we for some reason are unable to attack. Moving on though to our next key card, this is one of the best ramp pieces in the entire deck. I won't say it's the best, but it's definitely one of the best, and that is Ragemonger, which is 1 black-red for a 2/3 Minotaur Shaman. Minotaur spells you cast cost a black and red less to cast, and this effect reduces only the amount of colored mana that you pay. So if we have a Minotaur that costs, say, exactly a black and a red, that Minotaur is now free to cast. And while this doesn't seem initially apparent, this is incredibly powerful because a lot of Minotaurs have 2 to 3 different colored pips in their casting cost, and Ragemonger is going to make them cost much less and make it so that the actual mana colors we need aren't quite as intensive. So if we have plenty of Minotaurs that have double red in their casting cost, we are eliminating one of the red, so now we just need a single red to cast a single Minotaur, meaning that there's a good chance we can actually cast more in a single turn, even if it's not necessarily affecting the mana spent. So while Ragemonger looks a little bit weird on the outside, it definitely pulls its weight in this deck and does a great job of ramping us into some of our late game finishers. And then finally, moving on to our last key card, this one is going to be Neheb the Worthy. So the original legendary Minotaur, this is 1 a black and a red for a 2/2 Minotaur Warrior. He's got first strike, he gives other Minotaurs we control first strike, and as long as you have 1 or fewer cards in hand, Minotaurs you control get +2/+0, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, each player discards a card. So Neheb really is like the major payoff for the discard if we're focused in on the combat aspect of Minotaurs. Being able to give all of our Minotaurs first strike and +2/+0 makes Neheb kind of like a super Minotaur lord in a way that none of our other cards can even compete with. Being able to turn all of our 2/3 tokens with Sethron into 4/3s with first strike, plus maybe we can give an additional +1/+0 and then an additional menace or haste or whatever, means that we can really easily close out games and put our opponents on the back foot when they might not even be expecting it, simply because we have so many ways of giving haste in the deck, so many ways of kind of cheating some Minotaurs into play. And it is worth noting that because Neheb is 1 black-red, if we did have Ragemonger, he would be only a single mana of any color. So really, this kind of just highlights how powerful the synergies can be if the Minotaurs are all working together, and it's lucky that they all deal with the discard and the trample and the attacking, because that's really what our game plan is, and Neheb just makes it that much more effective. But anyway, those are all of our key cards, and the next thing we're going to be doing is moving on and taking a look at some cool interactions in the deck. These are cards that synergize very well with each other, and in some cases are win conditions or value engines, but a lot of times they're just cards that I want to highlight because I think they're kind of cool and I think they're unique for the deck. So the first pair of cards that I want to talk about is Neheb the Eternal and Fanatic of Mogus. So if you've been following this channel for a little while, you might know that Neheb the Eternal is one of my personal favorite commanders. I personally own a Neheb the Eternal deck that I'm very happy with, and is one of my longest running decks. So obviously, if we're playing Minotaurs, I gotta put my boy in here. Neheb, 3 red for a 4/6 legendary creature, Zombie Minotaur Warrior. Has afflict 3, so whenever it's blocked, defending player loses 3 life. And at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, you add a red mana for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So because we're intending to do a lot of attacking and maybe do some damage through discard and things like that, there's a very good chance that Neheb can consistently make like 6+ mana, assuming we're doing just 2 damage to each opponent. But if we partner that up with something like Fanatic of Mogus, we can get a ton more mana out of this. Because Fanatic of Mogus is 3 in a red for a 4/2 Minotaur Shaman. When it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to each opponent equal to your devotion to red. So if we say we have a completely clean slate, the only 2 cards in play are Neheb and Fanatic of Mogus, we are going to have 3 devotion to red, meaning each opponent is going to be taking 3 damage. That is 9 total life lost from among all of our opponents. So when we move to our post-combat main phase, we get 9 red mana. That is just with these 2 cards. There's, of course, plenty of other things we can be doing. We can attack. We can have more red pips on the battlefield. We can have some discard synergies going. This is a huge swing in our favor because this is going to let us dump pretty much our entire hand on the board, and hopefully our opponents won't have a board wipe to deal with it. But even if they do, we do have some ways in the deck to take additional combat phases, so there are some ways for us to take advantage of getting a ton of mana, casting a bunch of stuff, giving it haste, attacking again, and just probably winning the game kind of out of nowhere. And pretty much the way to start that is with Neheb and Fanatic. So I could keep talking about Neheb and the Fanatic of Mogus all day, but we're going to move on to our second pair of cards. And in this case, we're going to talk about Deathbellow Warcry and Kragma Warcaller. Deathbellow Warcry is one of my favorite cards in the entire deck just because it's so absurd. It's 5 red, so a massive 8 mana for a sorcery that says search your library for up to 4 Minotaur creature cards with different names, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So this is kind of like a super Minotaur tutor that's going to get us the exact 4 Minotaurs we need. And one of the best cards that we can ever get with this, and of course 3 other cards as well, is going to be Kragma Warcaller, which is 3 red for a 2/3 Minotaur Warrior that says Minotaur creatures you control have haste, and whenever a Minotaur you control attacks, it gets +2/+0 until the end of turn. So what this essentially does is as long as one of the 4 Minotaurs we get with the Warcry is Kragma Warcaller, we're able to give all of our Minotaurs +2/+0 when they attack, and they'll be able to attack immediately because they all have haste. This is a huge swing and can honestly just end games immediately, because if we can get Kragma Warcaller, maybe something like Neheb, or, well, either Neheb the Eternal, or the original Neheb, and then also things like that are giving trample, things that are giving +1/+1. We've got plenty of things like Fanatic of Mogus that can do damage. So it really just depends on what's still in your deck when you're able to cast the Warcry. But as long as you're getting Kragma Warcaller, you're probably going to be doing a ton of damage. And keeping in mind, if we have Sethron in play when this resolves, Sethron will see 4 Minotaurs enter the battlefield and make 4 Minotaur tokens. So not only did we get the 4 Minotaurs out of our deck, we got 4 more tokens, all of which have haste, all of which are getting +2/+0. So even without the cards that we're getting, we're still putting, what is that, 2, 4, 6, 8, plus another 8 on top of that power on the board. So just 16 power from the tokens. That can get out of hand incredibly quickly. But that is our last cool interaction for this deck. And the next thing I want to do is take a look at the price of the deck. So obviously, since our budget limit is $100, we got to be under that. And this week we were at $73.52, which is not incredibly cheap, but it's also pretty significantly under our budget limit. And surprisingly, a good portion of that comes from a single card, which is Didgeridoo. and that's a massive $17.41 for a 1-mana artifact that simply says pay 3 and put a Minotaur from your hand directly into play. So obviously this is very good in a Minotaur deck, but of course, like I said, it is $17. So if you did want to trim down the price of the deck, you could trim it to about $55 or so, and that is a huge improvement on the price just for getting rid of one card. But if you do want to have the kind of instant speed, put a Minotaur into play, be able to get kind of that mana advantage, then I would recommend Didgeridoo, although like I said, it is pretty expensive despite the fact that this is really the only deck that it could go in, so a little bit hit or miss. But other than that, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of our normal budget range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. And I know this is not the first time I have suggested this card. I feel like I suggest this card all the time, so hopefully it gets reprinted and is made a lot cheaper. But that card is Roaming Throne. And Roaming Throne is a massive $25.61, so it could technically be squeezed into our budget, but I don't think it's quite where we want to be. I don't want to squeeze $25 and an entire fourth of the budget out of one card if we don't really have to. But it really is just that good. And especially in this deck, Roaming Throne is 4 mana for a 4/4 golem. It has Ward 2. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Roaming Throne is the chosen type in addition to its other types, and if a triggered ability of another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time. So we have kind of looked at just non-stop Minotaur after Minotaur that have triggered abilities. Things like our commander, Sethron, triggers when another Minotaur enters the battlefield. So with Roaming Throne, we're now making 2 Minotaur tokens every single time we play a Minotaur. Neheb the Eternal is making red mana. That is a triggered ability that now triggers twice. We make double the red mana. There are plenty of things that can happen in this deck that can do damage, like Fanatic of Mogus that's going to be dealing double damage, or the Buccaneer that's going to be doing double damage. So there are a lot of ways that Roaming Throne just speeds up this deck and makes it absolutely just a nightmare for our opponents to have to deal with, which is probably why it's $25, because it goes in any typal deck, and it really is one of the best cards in that deck. Like I said, I've suggested this card multiple times, and unfortunately, unless it gets reprinted, I will probably continue to suggest it because it is very good, but also very expensive. So if you do put this card in, though, you would have to take a card out of the deck, and the card I would recommend taking out is Venomous Changeling, which is 2 and a black for a 1/3 shapeshifter. It's a changeling, and it has Death Touch. And that's about it. So it's not the worst Minotaur in the world, because believe me, there are some very bad Minotaurs that have been printed in Magic, but it's not great. A 3 mana 1/3 Minotaur with Death Touch is a little bit below the rate that we're looking for, because a lot of times a 3 mana 2/3 is kind of the going rate for Minotaurs. So we lose a power and gain Death Touch, but we actually have some other ways to give Death Touch in the deck, so it's not exactly unique. And I don't think it brings anything to the deck that Roaming Throne wouldn't, or maybe that some other Minotaurs wouldn't. But that's just my own personal opinion. If you disagree, please do let me know down in the comments. I would love to know what people think of Venomous Changeling, because I really went back and forth on whether I wanted it in the deck or not. So if you have an opinion, please let me know. I would love to hear it. But with all of that being said, that is the end of our deck tech, and we're going to have to jump into a game and see how this deck functions once it's actually put up against some other decks. But before we get to that, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel, and of course give a shout out to all of our patrons and channel members. So as always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. But if you want to go a little bit above and beyond, you can also check us out on Patreon and right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get access to things like the deck lists a week early. You get access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games that show up on the channel. So if you've ever wanted to be on the channel, that is a great way to do it. You get the guarantee from me that any suggested cards you have will be turned into videos eventually. Obviously, you can always send me your comments and send me an email, all of that stuff. If you have suggestions, I will do my best to get to everybody's, but I can't promise to get to them in the same way I can for our patrons and channel members. So, with that being said, I do want to shout out all of our patrons and channel members, so a huge thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Patty Whack, Keegan Tawney, and Jakar. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And without any further ado, let's move on and jump into our game. So as always, we are going to be joined this week by 3 different opponents. In this case, we are being joined by Vintage, who's playing Quasar, Augur of Agonies, AngryCow, who's playing Minthara, Merciless Soul, and Doodle, who's playing Colossal Doodle Maw. So starting off with Quasar, this is Vintage's life gain and also card draw and also kind of life loss deck. So he's got a couple of different things going in it, but what he really wants to do is focus on gaining and losing life through various means, whether it's with his commander or through combat. And it's more about him kind of controlling the pace of the game and figuring out who's gaining life, who's losing life. But he has a lot of very cool synergies and cards in this deck that I think are very unique, and he really brings his own building prowess to it. So I don't think we've seen Quasar on the channel before. I'm sure we'll see it again in the future, but I think it's a great deck. I've looked through it. I've kind of helped him tweak it a little bit. I think it's a ton of fun, and I'm very much looking forward to playing against it. Next up, we have Cow and his Minthara Merciless Soul deck. This is kind of a token aristocrats deck, and this is one of those moments where you realize that I've lost to an aristocrats deck from Cow specifically quite a few times, so I have a very healthy fear of Minthara in the command zone, especially because she can give herself ward and pump up the team. So it's not uncommon for Cow to stick Minthara and just kind of run away with the game and slowly pump up his team, and all of a sudden at the end of the game you're looking at 9/1, 1/1 soldier tokens and just kind of not knowing what to do. So I have lost to Minthara before. I'm sure I'll lose to Minthara again in the future. Hopefully this is not one of those times, so we will see what we can do. And then last but not least, we have Colossal Doodle Maw, which you may notice is not technically a real creature, but it is just a Colossal Dreadmaw. It's just 6 mana for a 6/6 trample dinosaur. This specific version was actually drawn and designed by Vintage, and so that's kind of why Doodle wanted to play it. But this is also a Colossal Dreadmaw deck. So this is quite literally the definition of a Rule 0 deck. You may know cards like Rat Colony that let you play any number of those cards in your deck. So we all as a group agreed that Doodle could play as many Colossal Dreadmaws as he wanted in a deck. And that was kind of where all of this led. We know that the Dreadmaw is Doodle's favorite card, and so Vintage made this for him. And so it's kind of just a nice way for Doodle to show off his Colossal Dreadmaw love and his, I guess, collection, for lack of a better term. So definitely a deck that I am looking forward to seeing. I know it's very unique and it's not something that you may see other places, but I have no doubt that it's going to be a ton of fun to play against. And honestly, Colossal Dreadmaw, probably pretty scary when there's a bunch of them on the battlefield. So we'll see what happens. I'm very excited for this game. I hope you all are as well. But let's jump into it, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Vintage goes first, followed by Cow, Doodle, and then myself. On Vintage's first turn, he plays a Thriving Isle, naming White, so it taps for both blue and white. Cow plays a Plains and casts Outside of Life's Bounty, which can sacrifice itself to give another creature protection from a color of his choice. Doodle plays a Forest. I play a Canyon Slough. Vintage plays a Swamp and casts Swiftfoot Boots. Cow plays a Swamp and attacks Vintage for 1, gaining a life thanks to lifelink. Then, in his second main phase, Cow casts Zulaport Cutthroat, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever a creature he controls dies. Doodle plays a Forest. I play a Swamp and cast Cathartic Reunion, discarding 2 cards and drawing 3. Notably, one of the cards I discard is Anger, giving all my creatures haste as long as it's in the graveyard, and I control a mountain, which I currently do thanks to Canyon Slough. Vintage plays a Swamp and casts Discerning Financier, letting him make a treasure in his upkeep if an opponent controls more lands than he does. Cow plays a Plains and casts Curse of Disturbance, enchanting me so whenever a player attacks me, Cow makes a 2/2 zombie token, and the opponent attacking me does the same. This lets him attack me and Doodle both for 1, making a zombie and gaining a life. Doodle plays a Forest and casts Garruk's Uprising, letting him draw a card whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters under his control, and also gives all his creatures trample. I play a Foreboding Ruin, revealing a mountain from my hand so that it comes into play untapped, then cast Arcane Signet. Vintage plays a Scoured Barrens, gaining a life, and cast Vivisector, letting him scry 1 whenever a creature he controls dies. He also equips the Vivisector with the Swiftfoot Boots, giving it hexproof and haste, so he can attack me and Doodle both for 2, make a zombie token, and also let Cow make a zombie token. On Cow's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking each of his opponents for 2, making a zombie and gaining a life. Then, in his second main phase, he plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1, and also casts Bastion of Remembrance, making a 1/1 soldier token and gaining a life while each opponent loses a life whenever a creature he controls dies. Doodle plays a Forest and casts Tempt with Discovery, searching his library for a land and putting it into play. Then, each of his opponents can do the same, but for each one that does, Doodle gets an additional land. Since his opponents all say no, Doodle only gets 1, choosing Temple of the False God. At the end of turn, I cast Demand Answers, discarding a card and drawing 2. Then on my turn, I play a Mountain and cast my commander Sethron Hurloon General, letting me make a 2/3 Minotaur token whenever he or another Minotaur enters under my control. Once that resolves, I attack Cow for 2 with my token, and he blocks with a zombie and soldier, killing the zombie and my Minotaur, letting him gain 2 life, while each of his opponents lose 2 life. In Vintage's upkeep, since Doodle controls more lands than him, he makes a treasure token, then casts his commander Quasar Augur of Agonies, so whenever he draws a card, he gains a life and target opponent loses a life. Then he attacks Doodle and Cow both for 2. Cow plays a War Room, then attacks Doodle and I both for 2, making a zombie token. I block the zombie attacking me with Sethron, killing it and making each of Cow's opponents lose 2 life, while he gains a total of 3. In his second main phase, Cow casts his commander, Minthara Merciless Soul, getting an experience counter in his end step if a permanent left his battlefield that turn. Then she also gets Ward X and gives his creatures +X+0, where X is the number of experience counters he has. Finally, he moves to his end step and gets an experience counter. Doodle plays a Forest and casts Colossal Dreadmaw, drawing a card. I cast Grizzly Survivor, which gets +2/+0 whenever I discard a card, triggering Sethron, making a Minotaur token. After that, I cast Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, and giving the Survivor +4/+0. I then play a Path of Ancestry and attack Cow for 6 with the Survivor and the token, but he blocks with both of his zombies, killing all 4 creatures, letting him gain 4 life while his opponents lose 4 life. When Vintage draws for turn, he gains a life and makes Cow lose a life, then makes a treasure in his upkeep since an opponent has more lands than him, then casts Phyrexian Rebirth, destroying all creatures and making a 9/9 Phyrexian Horror token since 9 creatures were destroyed this way. This also has Cow gaining 8 life while each of his opponents lose 8 life when his creatures are destroyed. On Cow's turn, he plays a Plains and passes. Doodle casts an Urgolem's Eye, then casts his commander Colossal Doodlemaw, drawing a card. On my turn, I recast my commander Sethron, also making another Minotaur token, and I attack Cow for 4 with Sethron, and in my second main phase, I play a Bojuka Bog, exiling Cow's graveyard. Vintage attacks Cow for 9 with his Horror token, and in his second main phase plays Azorius Chancery, returning Thriving Isle to his hand, and at the end of turn, Cow activates War Room, losing 2 life to draw a card, and still at the end of turn, Cow also flashes in Deep Gnome Terramancer, letting him search his library for a plains and put it into play whenever an opponent has a land come into play under their control that wasn't played. On Cow's turn, he plays a Swamp and casts Lingering Souls, making 2 1/1 spirits with flying. After that, he casts Vampiric Rites, letting him pay 2 mana to sacrifice a creature, gain a life, and draw a card. Doodle plays a Forest and casts Monstrous Vortex, letting him discover X whenever he casts a creature with power 5 or greater, where X is that creature's mana value. Then he casts a Colossal Dreadmaw, drawing a card, discovering into Harmonize, and drawing 3 more cards. On my turn, I cast Neheb the Eternal, letting me make red mana in my second main phase equal to the life my opponents have lost this turn. This also triggers my commander, making another Minotaur token, and I move to combat, attacking Vintage for 8 with Neheb and Sethron, making 8 red mana in my second main phase, which I use to cast Bloodline Pretender, naming Minotaur so it gets a +1/+1 counter when another Minotaur enters under my control, triggering Sethron to make another Minotaur token and putting a counter on the Pretender. I also cast Tangarth, Talroom Hero, making another token and putting 2 more counters on the Pretender. Vintage replays Thriving Isle, naming black when it enters, then casts Spirit Link, enchanting his Horror token, letting him gain life equal to the damage that it deals. At the end of turn, Cow sacrifices a Spirit token to draw a card, make each opponent lose a life, and gain 2 life. Then on Cow's turn, he plays a Hagra Broodpit and casts Austere Command, destroying all creatures with mana value 4 or greater and all artifacts. In response, I activate Tangarth, having him fight the Deep Gnome, killing it, letting Cow gain a life, while each of his opponents lose a life. Then the board wipe resolves, and once it's resolved, Cow attacks me for 1 with a Spirit, making a zombie token. On Doodle's turn, he casts another Colossal Dreadmaw, discovering into a Colossal Dreadmaw, which discovers into a Colossal Dreadmaw, which discovers into a Colossal Dreadmaw, which discovers into an Explosive Vegetation. This lets him search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped and drawing a total of 4 cards. On my turn, I cast a Kindred Charge, making token copies of all my Minotaurs that have to be exiled at the end of turn. This lets me attack Doodle with 7 Minotaurs for 14 total damage, and he blocks 4 of them, taking 6, and leaving me with only 1 Minotaur at the end of my turn. Vintage plays a Swamp and casts Phyrexian Obliterator, making any player sacrifice a number of permanents equal to the damage they deal to it. Cow casts a Grim Hireling, letting him make 2 treasure tokens whenever 1 or more creatures he controls deals combat damage to an opponent. Then he attacks me for 1 with a Spirit, making another zombie and 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Cow flashes back Lingering Souls, making 2 more spirits. Doodle plays a Forest and casts another Colossal Dreadmaw, which once again discovers into a Colossal Dreadmaw, which discovers into Migration's Path, letting him search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped and drawing 2 cards. Once that's resolved, he casts Earthshaker Dreadmaw, discovering into yet another Colossal Dreadmaw, which discovers into another Colossal Dreadmaw, which discovers into Eladamri's Vineyard, letting each player make 2 green mana in their pre-combat main phase. Then the Colossal Dreadmaws all resolve, with Doodle drawing 3 cards from Garruk's Uprising, and the Earthshaker Dreadmaw resolves last, drawing him a card for each other dinosaur he controls, which is currently 8. Finally, he moves to combat, attacking Cow for a total of 24 damage with 4 of his Dreadmaws. In my first main phase, I make 2 green mana and use it to cast Kindred Dominance, destroying all non-Minotaur creatures. In response, Cow sacrifices both his zombies to draw 2 cards and gain 4 life, while each of his opponents lose 2. Then, when the board wipe resolves, Cow gains another 4 life and each of his opponents lose another 4. After that, I attack Cow with my remaining Minotaur for 2. Vintage plays a thriving Moor, naming Blue when it enters, and recasts his commander Quasar using the 2 green mana he gets from Doodle. On Cow's turn, he casts Daxos the Returned, getting an experience counter whenever he casts an enchantment, and also letting him pay 3 mana to make a spirit token with power and toughness equal to the number of experience counters he has. He immediately activates Daxos, making a 1/1 spirit token. Doodle plays a Cavernous Maw and recasts his commander Colossal Doodle Maw, discovering into another Colossal Dreadmaw, which discovers into another Colossal Dreadmaw, which again discovers into another Colossal Dreadmaw, which discovers into Nissa's Renewal, letting him search his library for 3 basic lands, put them into play tapped, and gain 7 life. Before that can resolve though, Cow sacrifices his spirit token to draw a card, gain 2 life, and make each opponent lose a life, knocking Doodle out of the game before the stack of dinosaurs can resolve. I play a mountain and cast Patriarch's Bidding, letting each player name a creature type and returning all creatures of the named types from the graveyard to their owner's battlefield. The types named for this are Minotaur, Rogue, and Phyrexian. Luckily, nobody named Incarnation, so I still have Anger in my graveyard, letting me immediately attack Cow with my entire board for 17 total damage. Before blocks, Cow activates Daxos to make another spirit token, then blocks the Bloodline Pretender and Grizzly Survivor, killing the Survivor, his Grim Hireling, and his spirit token, taking 10 damage, but also gaining 2 life and making each of his opponents lose 2 life. Then, when I move to my second main phase, I make 12 red mana thanks to Neheb, letting me recast my commander Sethron, making another Minotaur token when he enters. Then I also cast Conspiracy Theorist, letting me exile cards that I discard and cast them until the end of turn. When Vintage draws for his turn, he gains a life and makes Cow lose a life, then cast Pondering Mage, letting him look at the top 3 cards of his library, putting them back in any order and drawing a card, making me lose a life while he gains a life. He then moves to combat, attacking Cow for 3 with Quasar, and attacks me for 5 with Phyrexian Obliterator. Cow takes the damage while I block with my Minotaur token, killing it, taking 2 from Trample, and since I dealt 2 damage to the Obliterator, I'm forced to sacrifice 2 permanents, sacrificing a mountain and a swamp. In Vintage's second main phase, he casts Treacherous Greed, sacrificing Phyrexian Obliterator since it dealt combat damage this turn, and letting him draw 3 cards and gain 3 life, while also making each of his opponents lose 3 life. In response, I activate Tangarth, having it fight Quasar, killing Vintage's commander but keeping me in the game. On Cow's turn, he plays a Bojuka Bog, exiling Vintage's graveyard, then casts Seal of Cleansing, which can be sacrificed to destroy an artifact or enchantment, also triggering Daxos, giving him another experience counter. On my turn, I play a Temple of Malice, scrying 1, and activate Sethron, giving all my Minotaurs +1/+0 and Menace, letting me attack Cow for 13 and Vintage for 15 with all of my Minotaurs. But before damage, Cow activates Daxos, creating a spirit token, and immediately sacrifices it to draw a card, gain 2 life, and make each opponent lose a life, knocking me out of the game and preventing all the damage that was about to happen. Before I'm fully gone though, I do use Tangarth to fight Daxos, but Cow responds by also sacrificing Daxos, drawing another card, gaining another 2 life, and making each opponent lose another life. On Vintage's turn, he plays a Memorial to Folly, then casts Elesh Norn, making any opponent who deals damage to him or his permanents either pay 1 mana or lose 2 life. After that, he casts Cruel Celebrant, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever a creature or planeswalker he controls dies. He moves to combat, attacking Cow for 5 with his Pondering Mage and Vivisector. Cow casts a Soul Ring, followed up by casting Master of Ceremonies, and also casts Ellen Harbree's Busybody, which can tap to let Cow look at the top X cards of his library and put 1 into his hand, where X is the number of tokens he's created that turn. Vintage plays a Buried Ruin and casts Vengeful Warchief, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever Vintage loses life for the first time each turn. He then casts Leyline of Sanctity, giving himself Hexproof. In Cow's upkeep, Master of Ceremonies triggers, letting Vintage choose to draw a card, make a 1/1 citizen token, or make a treasure token, but whatever he chooses, Cow gets the same thing. In this case, Vintage chooses to draw a card, so Cow also draws a card. Cow then plays a Plains and casts Rabble Rousing, hiding away a card and letting him make a 1/1 citizen token for each creature he attacks with. This lets him attack Vintage for 3 with Master of Ceremonies to make a citizen token, and Vintage blocks with Vengeful Warchief, but before damage, Cow casts Rescue the Foal, exiling his Master of Ceremonies and returning it to the battlefield under his control, saving it. In his second main phase, Cow casts Pegasus Guardian from exile, letting him make a 1/1 Pegasus token with flying when he moves to his end step, since a permanent he controlled left the battlefield this turn. Still at the end of turn, he activates Ellen to look at the top 2 cards of his library, putting one into his hand and the other onto the bottom. Vintage plays an Unknown Shores and casts Personal Sanctuary, preventing all damage that would be dealt to him during his turn. Then he attacks Cow with his entire board for 13 total damage. Cow blocks 3 creatures, killing his 2 tokens, taking 3 damage, and then, thanks to Elesh Norn's ability, taking another 6 damage, going to only 1 life. However, since 2 of his creatures died in the exchange, Cow also gains 2 life while Vintage loses 2 life, allowing him to put a +1/+1 counter on the Warchief. In Cow's upkeep, Master of Ceremonies triggers, and this time both players make a treasure token. Cow then casts Touch the Spirit Realm, attempting to exile Elesh Norn, but Vintage has a response, countering it with Dovin's Veto. Once that's resolved, Cow recasts his commander Minthara, notably giving all his creatures +2/+0 since he currently has 2 experience counters, and this lets Cow attack Vintage for 14 total damage, so even after he blocks with Elesh Norn, he still takes 9, knocking Vintage out and winning Cow the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on. Definitely a very punchy game. I think that if we start with Doodle and his Dreadmaws, he really got out of control at the end of the game, and I think that if it weren't for the board wipe, he probably would have wound up winning, because being able to survive with just 15 Colossal Dreadmaws in play, or however many he had, is a huge swing in his favor. But it was a super cool deck to see, and I really liked the Discover mechanic being used to find more and more of the Colossal Dreadmaws. I thought that was super cool and super creative, and definitely a deck that I would not mind to face again in the future. I don't think it was a, busted Rule Zero commander situation. I think it was a lot of fun, and I think it kind of fit the vibes of the table. Moving on to our deck, we can talk about Sethron. Definitely did what I wanted it to do. I've actually thought about building my own personal Sethron deck for quite a while now, and this deck really made me kind of think that that is a pretty good idea. I really liked the way that it played. I liked the difference between the aggressive style and the discard outlets, and just kind of the different axes that the deck could play on. I think that in the future, having playtested it a few times, I think that I would probably put more mass reanimation into the deck. We currently have just a handful. I think it could use some more, but let me know what you think, whether or not that you think that's a good idea. Continuing to move around the table, we of course have Vintage. He came so incredibly close to being able to win that game. He was literally 1 point of damage short at one point, and I think that if he had pointed, I think at one point he pointed a point of damage at me with Quasar. I think if he had pointed it at Cow, he might have been able to win, but then I don't know if I would have died, so who knows. The math was very, very complicated right at the end of that game, but Vintage came so incredibly close to being able to win. And then last but not least, of course, Cow, walking out with the victory with Minthara. That deck is definitely a handful. It has got a lot going on. It's got a lot more math than I personally would want to deal with, so I'm glad that Cow was able to keep it all together. But it is incredibly powerful, and you don't really expect Minthara to put in that much work, even if you're just getting 1 experience counter a turn. So I know that Cow has leaned into using Daxos and enchantments a little bit more to try to double up on his experience counters, which I think is super, super cool, and it adds a nice little additional gameplay aspect to the deck. So Overall, a super fun game. I had a ton of fun with it. I hope you all enjoyed watching it. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. If you have any future ideas for decks, please do let me know down in the comments. And as always, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. But with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.